I arrived in Boston late at night during a snowstorm. The city streets were nearly empty, covered in a thick layer of wet snow that reflected the orange glow of streetlights. The wind was biting, and snowflakes whipped against my face as I struggled to pull my coat tighter. The drive had been long, and my flight delayed, so by the time I reached the downtown hotel, I was exhausted and eager to get inside. The hotel's exterior looked ordinary enough, a tall building with glass doors and a revolving entrance. Snow had accumulated in small drifts along the sides of the sidewalk. I pushed through the doors and stepped into the lobby, shaking off my coat and wiping my boots on the mat. The lobby was quiet, almost unnervingly so. A single night clerk sat behind the front desk, his face dimly lit by a small lamp. He looked up as I approached but didn't say much, only handed me a key card with a small nod. I didn't expect anyone else to be around. The elevator ride up to my floor was slow, each floor marked by a small, flickering light above the doors. When the elevator finally stopped, I stepped out into a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The carpet was a deep burgundy, the walls pale beige, and the faint smell of cleaning chemicals lingered in the air. My room was at the far end of the hallway. I swiped my card, entered, and locked the door behind me. The room was small but clean. The bed was neatly made, a thin comforter tucked under the mattress, and a desk sat against the wall with a small lamp casting a soft glow. I didn't unpack much. I only set my bag down, changed into more comfortable clothes, and climbed into bed. The snowstorm outside had left the streets silent, and I felt relief that I was finally somewhere warm and sheltered. I closed my eyes, exhausted, expecting to fall asleep immediately. Around midnight, I awoke suddenly. At first, I thought it was the wind or the storm outside, but then I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. My heart immediately picked up pace. They weren't the hurried, stumbling footsteps of a drunk guest returning from the bar. These were slow, measured, precise, and unnervingly deliberate. They stopped outside my door. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I strained to listen. Then I heard breathing. Not loud, but steady, controlled. My first thought was that it was another guest, maybe someone disoriented or lost, but the sound didn't match any human behavior I had experienced. It was deliberate, like someone was waiting for something. Panic set in. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers trembling. I dialed the front desk. The line clicked, and the night clerk answered immediately, his voice calm and detached. He told me there was no one else on my floor. That didn't make sense. I could hear the steps shifting slightly, and the breathing continued. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe someone had entered the building through another entrance. Maybe they had been hiding on the floor. I felt trapped. I grabbed the flashlight on my phone and, with shaking hands, slowly unlocked the door. I opened it just enough to peer down the hallway. The dim light from the ceiling barely illuminated the corridor, but about halfway down, I saw him. A man was standing there, wearing a long, dark coat. He wasn't moving, just staring at my door. I couldn't see his face clearly. The shadows swallowed it, but I could feel his gaze. My stomach dropped. I slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away slowly. My hands were clammy, and my legs felt weak. I called the police immediately, my voice tight and trembling. I stayed in the corner of the room, flashlight in hand, listening. The steps continued for a few minutes, then slowly faded into silence. The snowstorm outside was muffling sound, but I knew the man was still somewhere on the premises. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I had locked the door and that the police were on their way. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. My eyes were constantly on the door, my ears straining for any noise. Every creak in the hallway made me jump. When the police arrived, they were efficient but skeptical. They checked the floor and the surrounding areas. No one was found. No sign of forced entry. No one else was on the floor. The hotel claimed that their security cameras didn't capture anything unusual. I insisted on a report, describing the man and his position in the hallway. The officers took my statement, writing down every detail I could remember. The coat, the way he stood, the intensity of his gaze. I stayed in the lobby while they conducted their search, my coat wrapped tightly around me, my boots wet from the slush and snow I had tracked inside. Even after the police left, I didn't feel safe. I went to the front desk and requested a new room on a different floor. The clerk was polite but seemed reluctant, as if trying to assure me it was unnecessary. I insisted. They moved me to a room on the opposite side of the building, far from the hallway I had been in. That night, I double-checked the locks, wedged the chair against the door, and set my phone on the bed with emergency numbers dialed in. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow, Every sound from the hallway made my chest tighten. The next morning, I packed up and left. The snowstorm had passed, leaving the streets icy and quiet. I didn't linger. I told the hotel management I wouldn't be staying there again and requested a full refund. They complied without argument, but their faces were unreadable, blank. I never learned who the man in the hallway was, if he had been staying there, or if he was even supposed to be in the building. The police never found any leads. Security footage remained inconclusive, as if he had simply vanished into thin air. I realized later that the experience had shaken me more than I initially admitted. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was the realization that someone had been able to position themselves so close to me without my knowledge, without leaving a trace. It was terrifyingly real, and it didn't require explanation. I kept thinking about how easily someone could have forced entry, how little control I really had in that situation. Weeks passed, and the memory didn't fade. Every time I traveled, I checked the hotel reviews meticulously, looking for anything about strange occurrences, unauthorized access, or suspicious guests. I became hyper-aware of hotel security, of locks, of surveillance cameras. Even now, years later, I still recall that dark hallway, the long coat, and the way he had just stood there waiting. It was a reminder that sometimes danger doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it simply waits silently, and all you can do is hope you're never alone when it chooses to appear. I never returned to that hotel. I switched chains, always requesting rooms in busy areas or near the front desk. I carry a small personal alarm now when I travel, and I double-check all doors and windows, even when the room seems secure. That night in Boston left me with a lasting vigilance I couldn't shake. I survived without harm, but the experience taught me that safety is never guaranteed. You can lock doors, you can call the police, but the fear lingers because the threat is real, and the unknown is impossible to control. I have never stayed in a hotel the same way again. I was staying at a mid-range hotel downtown in Chicago for a business trip. The building was tall but not the tallest in the area, and my room was on the 17th floor. When I first arrived, the lobby struck me as standard for a business hotel. Nothing extravagant, nothing luxurious, but clean, with a faint scent of polished wood and faint coffee. The receptionist was polite, efficient, and gave me my key with a smile that didn't feel forced. The elevator ride up was uneventful, smooth, and quick, though I noticed the slight hum and vibration typical of older high-rise elevators. As I reached the 17th floor, I stepped off into a narrow hallway. The carpet was thin and slightly worn, with a dull pattern that had obviously seen years of shoes and luggage rolling over it. The lighting was muted, the bulbs warm, but not bright enough to make the hall feel welcoming. Each door was a neutral brown, and each had a small, plastic peephole that reflected a little light back at me. My room number was 1704. The first impression of the room was normal. Standard mid-range hotel layout. A queen bed pushed against one wall, a small desk in the corner, a television mounted on the wall opposite the bed, and a window that ran almost floor to ceiling. The furniture was functional, clean, and free of odors beyond the faint chemical scent of cleaning products. I placed my suitcase on the luggage rack and walked to the window. The view was expansive, a full slice of Chicago's skyline. From this height, the streets below were tiny, cars like toys moving along grid lines. Street lights, traffic signals, and neon signs flickered in a controlled chaos. The other buildings loomed nearby, their windows catching reflections of the city lights. I remember thinking it was a nice view, something to make a long business trip slightly more bearable. Evening came, and after dinner at a small nearby restaurant, I returned to the room. I was tired, my body still adjusting to travel, and a day full of meetings. I showered, set an alarm for early morning, and settled into the bed with a book. The city lights outside were calming, a subtle distraction from the work that awaited me tomorrow. Everything was normal, nothing unusual at all. I woke up abruptly around 2 a.m. to a faint, almost imperceptible noise. It was soft at first, almost like someone brushing their fingers along a rough surface. I froze, my body stiff with immediate alertness. The sound was coming from the window. At first, I told myself it had to be some kind of city noise, construction somewhere below, maybe a bird caught on the ledge outside. I strained my ears. The scratching continued. It was deliberate, rhythmic, and uneven, not mechanical or accidental. I felt my chest tighten. The window, which I had assumed was securely closed, seemed somehow louder than usual when it vibrated slightly from the noise. I got out of bed and moved closer. The window had a lock, a small metal latch that clicked firmly into place. I could see the faint reflection of the room's lights on the glass, but outside, across the narrow gap between buildings, I could make out movement. A shadow slipped along the edge of the building next to mine. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks, but it didn't vanish. It was unmistakable, a figure moving along the ledge, crouched, careful, deliberate. I pressed my forehead against the glass. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a bird, this wasn't construction. Someone had somehow gotten onto the ledge. I stepped back and tried to remain calm, though my pulse was racing. The scratching sound increased, almost as if the figure had noticed me pressing against the window. My mind ran through every scenario imaginable. This was the 17th floor. No normal person could have climbed up here unnoticed. How could someone even get onto the ledge? The hotel was in a busy part of downtown, surrounded by taller buildings, but still, the sheer impracticality of it was terrifying. I grabbed my phone and called the front desk. The line clicked and the receptionist's calm voice answered. I explained the situation, voice shaking slightly despite my best effort to sound composed. They told me it was impossible. No one could have been on the ledge. The hotel had surveillance, and no one had entered my room or gone outside. They assured me it was very unlikely anyone could have done what I described. But I had seen it. The shadow had been real, the scratching undeniable. I hung up, heart pounding, and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process what had just happened. The rest of the night was sleepless. Every creak of the building, every distant horn or siren made me flinch. I kept my phone in hand, eyes glued to the window. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement, a flicker, a shape that shouldn't be there. I debated leaving the room and sleeping in the hallway, but the thought of stepping out into the dimly lit corridor felt equally unsafe. I could not make sense of the situation, my mind cycling through paranoia, disbelief, and fear. Morning arrived in a gray, muted light. Exhausted, I dressed quickly and went to the front desk. Maintenance met me in the hallway and walked me back to the room. They examined the window, moving the latch, pressing along the frame. One of them muttered about it being slightly loose, an old seal that had warped over time. They explained, in a tone meant to reassure, that technically, it was possible someone could have manipulated the latch from the outside if they had extreme climbing skills and tools, but it was highly unlikely. They even noted that the ledge outside was narrow, exposed, and dangerous, requiring balance, experience, and no small amount of luck. I inspected the ledge from inside. It was a thin strip of concrete, maybe 8 inches wide, running along the side of the building. One misstep, one slip, and it was a fatal drop. I felt the weight of the previous night all over again, the pulse of fear that had kept me frozen, imagining someone climbing or crouching outside my window. My stomach churned at the thought. Maintenance suggested reporting it to security for the record, and I did. They promised to review footage, though I knew downtown security cameras rarely captured ledges between buildings. I checked out immediately. I didn't linger, didn't want to have another night like that. I packed my bags quickly, moving like someone who had experienced a close call with danger and was ready to escape. The lobby felt different under the morning sun. Familiar, normal, yet something in the atmosphere now seemed heavier. I couldn't explain why, but the brief glimpse of what could have been death on the ledge had altered my perception. Even the polished floors and the smell of coffee seemed to mock my fear from the night before. As I left, I noticed the window again from the outside, framed by the neighboring building's reflection. The ledge was narrow, impossible for a casual person to traverse, but I remembered the shadow, the scratching. The memory burned itself into my mind. I thought about how someone could have exploited that loose latch, how close I had unknowingly been to encountering a real intruder on the 17th floor. My relief was tinged with disbelief, the kind that comes from surviving something incomprehensible, yet entirely plausible. The flight home was quiet. I replayed the night over and over, the scratching, the shadow, the impossible ledge. I realized how fragile our sense of safety really is, even in a busy modern city. I promised myself I would never take a window lock for granted again. Every time I tell the story, I remember that sound, that fleeting movement, and the stark realization that danger can be closer, higher, and more unlikely than anyone expects. I never stayed at that hotel again, and I made sure to check every window, every latch, every possible opening, on every trip since. The memory of the locked window, the shadow moving along the ledge, and the scratching that woke me in the middle of the night remains vivid. It was a reminder that even in the controlled, bustling environment of downtown Chicago, the world can become terrifyingly small when someone, or something, defies what we believe to be impossible. I arrived in New Orleans in the late afternoon, the sunlight filtering through the narrow streets of the French Quarter, bouncing off the wrought iron balconies and uneven brick sidewalks. The air was heavy with humidity, a mix of blooming jasmine, exhaust fumes, and the faint tang of the Mississippi River not far away. The city had a rhythm to it, a pulse of music, chatter, and distant laughter that felt alive and old all at once. I had booked a boutique hotel tucked away on a quieter street, off the main tourist paths, hoping for a calm place to rest after a long flight and hours wandering the quarter. The hotel looked inviting from the outside, with a small iron gate opening into a courtyard lined with potted ferns and the smell of strong coffee wafting from inside. The lobby was warm and dimly lit, with polished wooden floors that creaked softly under my weight and shelves lined with old books and brass ornaments. The receptionist was polite and professional, handing me a key card and pointing me toward room 312. The hallways leading to the rooms were narrow and slightly musty, the lighting muted, casting long shadows on the faded wallpaper. I noticed a faint smell of mildew mixed with the lingering aroma of cleaning chemicals, a combination that gave the corridor a strange, antiseptic feeling. When I reached the door to room 312, my first thought was that it was oddly cold, even though the hallway had been warm. The door didn't latch properly. It stuck slightly, and I had to jiggle the handle a few times before it fully closed. I pushed the door open, and the room greeted me with an almost unnatural cleanliness. Everything was in its place, perfectly arranged, as if the room had been staged for photographs. The bedspread was tightly tucked, the pillows fluffed into perfect pyramids, the small desk cleared of any dust or personal marks. The curtains hung straight without a wrinkle, and even the air felt filtered and precise, lacking the subtle signs of recent human presence that a hotel room usually carries. I stepped inside cautiously, placing my suitcase on the floor and running my hand along the nightstand, expecting some evidence of previous occupancy. Crumbs, a forgotten pen, a stray hair, but there was nothing. Not a single imperfection. It was too clean, too perfect, and that sense of wrongness began to creep into my stomach like a slow, cold burn. I tried to push the feeling aside, telling myself it was just a new or freshly renovated room. I unpacked slowly, but then I noticed something that made my heart skip. My suitcase, which I had left zipped and light, suddenly felt much heavier when I lifted it to place it on the bed. Frowning, I unzipped it and froze. On top of my clothes were several neatly folded garments that I did not recognize. They were clean, carefully stacked, and unmistakably not mine. Shirts, pants, a small pair of shoes, all arranged with meticulous precision. My stomach sank. Someone had been in this room before me, living in it, using it as their own space. A faint panic started to claw at my chest, the kind that tightens your throat and makes it hard to breathe. I backed away from the suitcase, my eyes scanning the room again for anything else that could explain it. Any trace of a previous guest, any sign that housekeeping had made a mistake. But there was nothing else. No leftover toiletries, no wrappers, no personal items, nothing. The air in the room suddenly felt oppressive, the walls too close, the dim lighting casting angles that made the room feel smaller than it should. My instincts screamed at me that staying here was a bad idea, but I felt trapped by my own luggage and the quiet expectation of a hotel room. I took the keycard back to the front desk, walking quickly through the narrow hallway, my shoes tapping against the wooden floor. My hands were shaking slightly, my chest tight. At the desk, I demanded an explanation, but the receptionist could only give a vague apology about an issue with room assignments, and offered me a new key for a different room. I returned to room 312 just long enough to grab my essentials, leaving the suitcase with the strange clothes behind, and followed the receptionist's directions to the new room. The hallway seemed longer this time, shadows deeper, the musty smell stronger. I couldn't shake the image of my suitcase, the neat piles of clothes that didn't belong to me, the idea that someone had been living just steps away, unnoticed, for days. The new room was smaller, not as immaculate, and it had the normal signs of previous occupancy. A faint wrinkle on the bedspread, a lone paperclip on the desk, a few dust specks in the corners. But somehow, that imperfection was reassuring. I unpacked my things carefully, double-checked the lock on the door, and made sure I could hear the latch click firmly into place. The paranoia didn't completely leave me, though. Every creak in the floor, every shift of the old pipes in the walls made me flinch. Every shadow seemed too sharp, every knock from the hallway too loud. I slept lightly, waking several times to check the door, listening for the slightest sound of movement outside. By the next day, I had begun to settle a little, though the previous night's unease lingered. I walked the French Quarter cautiously, glancing at the street from corners and across the busy intersections. I tried to distract myself with the music spilling from jazz bars and the scent of beignet drifting from the small cafes. Still, there was a part of my mind that couldn't let go of the image of someone squatting in room 312, someone who could have had access not just to that room, but possibly others in the hotel. Later, when I returned home, I spoke with a friend familiar with hotels in the area, and they confirmed my worst suspicions. Apparently, a previous guest had been living in room 312 for several days, using stolen or duplicate keys to access the room unnoticed. Staff had failed to catch them in time, and the guest had left behind no sign of forced entry, no trace of their presence beyond the clothing and items left in the room. It was a breach that could have put any guest at serious risk. I never returned to that hotel. The experience stayed with me, a lingering unease whenever I travel. I double-check locks, I inspect rooms thoroughly before settling in, and I never leave my belongings unattended. The idea that someone could quietly live in the same space I occupy, unseen and undetected, left a mark that no amount of travel or familiarity could erase. Every time I walk into a hotel room now, I make sure to lock the door, check for anything unusual, and imagine the possibility that the room might not be entirely mine, that someone else's presence could be hiding just out of sight, waiting to be discovered. It was a lesson learned the hard way. Even in a place that feels safe, even in a city alive with tourists and music and color, there are spaces where the rules of privacy and security can fail completely. That room, room 312, will always remain a warning in my mind, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that someone else's presence can linger in a space without leaving the obvious signs, and that vigilance is the only way to truly feel secure in a place that's supposed to be a temporary home. I arrived in Miami on a Friday afternoon, the heat hitting me as soon as I stepped out of the taxi. The hotel was in a slightly older part of the city, not far from the beach but tucked behind a row of faded shops and small diners. From the outside, it didn't look fancy, but the price had been right for a weekend getaway. I carried my bag up to the small lobby, which smelled faintly of cleaning products, and something else I couldn't immediately identify. The receptionist handed me my key without much fuss. She smiled politely, and I followed the narrow hallway to my room, feeling the air conditioning slowly take the edge off the floor to heat. The room was small but clean. The walls were painted a soft beige, and the carpet was worn in some corners but vacuumed. The bed was made neatly, and there was a small desk and chair against one wall. By the window, a mini fridge sat tucked under a counter. I assumed it was just for drinks and a few snacks, the typical thing you'd find in a budget hotel. I set my bag down, kicked off my sandals, and went to the balcony to take in the view. From there, I could see the street below, cars driving by, and a few people walking dogs. It was normal, ordinary, unthreatening, the kind of view you could just watch for a while and feel detached from the chaos of the city. I stayed out there for a few minutes before coming back inside and deciding to get ready for the evening. The day had been long and hot at the beach. I was tired, my skin sticky from sunscreen and sweat. All I wanted was a cold drink. I opened the mini fridge, reaching for a bottle of water I had brought with me. At first, I thought it was empty aside from a few forgotten soda cans, but then I noticed something odd in the back. There was a plastic bag, translucent enough to see inside, and it contained something that looked like raw meat. It was partially thawed, slimy, and the smell hit me immediately, a faint but unmistakable stench of something decaying. My stomach turned violently. I stepped back, my mind racing. How could something like that be in a hotel fridge? I instinctively checked the corners of the bag, trying to convince myself it was some kind of food packaging mistake, but there was no mistaking it. This was raw meat, left inside a fridge that I was supposed to use. My hand shook slightly as I closed the fridge, unable to look at it again. I called the front desk immediately, explaining the situation. Within minutes, the manager arrived, a middle-aged man with a pressed shirt and a slightly nervous smile. He explained quickly that it was probably leftover supplies from a maintenance worker and that it wasn't a health hazard. He offered to move me to another room, and I agreed, though every instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong. I grabbed my bag and followed him down the hall. The new room was on the opposite side of the building, slightly larger and cleaner, with a newer mini fridge that looked unused. I unpacked my things, trying to push away the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. That night, lying in bed, I tried to ignore the events. I turned on the television to distract myself, scrolling through local channels until I finally gave up. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. That's when I heard it, soft thumps coming from the direction of the old room. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the thumps came again, rhythmic, almost deliberate, from the other side of the wall where the fridge in my original room had been. My heart rate spiked. It was faint, almost polite in its volume, but unmistakable. Something was moving inside that fridge. I sat up in bed, listening. Each thump made my stomach tighten, a mixture of fear and disgust that I couldn't shake. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably just the building settling, the old pipes shifting, or maybe the fridge had been left running in the room next door. None of those explanations felt convincing. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every small sound in the hotel felt amplified. The distant hum of the air conditioning, the creak of the floorboards in the hallway, the occasional car horn from the street below. I kept imagining someone, or something, returning to the fridge in that first room. The thought of raw meat, thawing and left unattended, made my stomach churn over and over. I realized I had never fully inspected the fridge when the manager had shown up, too caught up in the disbelief of the situation. I hadn't thought to take a photo or to ask if it had been removed properly. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Had it been someone using that room for some kind of improper storage? Had it been there for days, maybe weeks? Was it even the manager's explanation, or was there something more off about that part of the hotel? I couldn't know. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I could feel that fridge's presence from across the hall, every thump stabbing at my nerves. By morning, I was exhausted. I showered quickly, dressed, and went down to check out, eager to leave. The lobby seemed normal again, polite but detached. The receptionist handed me the bill, and I paid, trying not to let my unease show. On the way out, I glanced at the hallways, at the rooms that stretched down the faded carpet, and I imagined what could be inside each one. That image stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind as I stepped outside into the warm Miami morning. I flagged down a taxi and told the driver the hotel's name, hoping he hadn't seen anything odd himself. As the car pulled away, I looked back at the building, a simple structure that would probably look like any other to anyone passing by. But to me, it would forever be the place where something deeply wrong had waited in a mini fridge behind a closed door. I didn't return to that part of the city for the rest of the weekend. I spent the remaining time walking along crowded beaches, eating at well-lit restaurants, and making sure never to enter another hotel room with a mini fridge in view. The incident stayed with me far longer than I expected. I began imagining how often maintenance supplies or leftovers might be stored improperly, and the thought of something like that being left behind in a room for the next guest made me shiver. I became careful about hotel reviews, always reading for complaints about cleanliness, and I never trusted a fridge in a budget room again. Even now, months later, whenever I see a mini fridge in a hotel room, my skin prickles, and I recall that soft, deliberate thumping from the other side of the wall. The memory so vivid it almost feels like it's happening all over again. That weekend in Miami had been ordinary at first glance, but in the end, it left me with a quiet, nagging fear, a reminder that even the most mundane parts of a hotel could hide something deeply unsettling. I had an early flight out of Los Angeles, so I booked a cheap motel near LAX, mostly because it was close and convenient. The drive from downtown was long, filled with the usual stop-and-go traffic and the constant haze of smog that clung to the city like a dirty curtain. By the time I reached the motel, it was already dusk. The building looked tired, faded paint peeling in places, a flickering neon sign that struggled to stay lit. The parking lot was cracked, weeds growing through the asphalt, and a few cars with flat tires or broken windows sat abandoned near the far edge. I parked near the entrance and carried my bag to the small lobby, which smelled of a mix of cleaning chemicals and cigarette smoke. A ceiling fan whirred lazily above, spinning in uneven, rattling circles. There was only one clerk behind the desk, a man who looked as tired and worn as the place itself. He handed me my key without much of a glance and muttered something about the elevator being out of order. I didn't ask for more, I just wanted to get to the room, shower, and try to sleep before my flight. The hallway to my room was narrow, dimly lit by a series of flickering fluorescent lights. The carpet was threadbare, faded brown with stains I didn't want to think about. My room was small, barely enough space to fit a bed, a small desk, and a chair. The air smelled faintly of smoke, even though the non-smoking sign on the door suggested otherwise. I set my bag down on the floor and tried to ignore the faint hum of traffic and planes overhead. I needed to find the bathroom to wash up, so I began to look around. As I moved the small closet door open, my eyes caught a small panel behind it. It was about the size of a large filing cabinet door, made of thin wood with a rusty, broken lock. At first, I thought it was just a maintenance access panel or a storage nook, but something about it drew me in. My curiosity got the better of me. I didn't know why I felt the urge to open it, only that I couldn't leave without knowing what was behind it. I grabbed a pen from my desk and carefully pried at the lock. The door groaned and shifted under the pressure, then gave way, swinging open with a faint creak. Inside was a tiny windowless room. It was cramped, barely wide enough for me to stand in without touching the walls. The air was musty, thick with the smell of old fabric, dirt, and something else I couldn't immediately identify. Old furniture was stacked haphazardly against the walls. An armchair with torn upholstery, a small wooden table, a dresser with drawers that didn't open properly. On the floor was a makeshift bed, a thin mattress covered in stained sheets, and a blanket that looked like it had been used for months without being washed. There were a few clothes hanging from hooks and some empty food containers scattered in a corner. My heart started pounding as I realized what I was looking at. Someone had been living here, hidden in the motel walls, probably for weeks or even months. The thought made my skin crawl. I imagined the person moving silently behind the walls, possibly watching the guests who stayed above them. I pictured them slipping out at night, unseen, taking what they needed and disappearing into the dark. I stepped back, feeling a mix of fear and disbelief. The room was small, almost suffocating, and I couldn't help but wonder how the person managed to survive in such a place. The idea of someone living like that, completely invisible to the staff and guests, made my stomach turn. I wanted to leave immediately, but I felt compelled to make sure I wasn't imagining it. I carefully closed the door behind me and leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. I grabbed my bag and went straight to the front desk. The clerk looked at me, surprised, when I told him what I had found. He offered me another room, brushing it off as though it wasn't a serious concern. He didn't call the police or maintenance. There was no sense of urgency in his voice. I could see in his eyes that he didn't really care. I left my belongings behind, refusing to stay another second in that building, and checked out immediately. The idea that someone could be living in hidden spaces like that, unseen, had left me feeling shaken in a way I couldn't easily shake off. Back in my car, I sat for a while, gripping the steering wheel and trying to calm down. I kept thinking about that tiny dark room, the smell of old blankets, the scattered food containers, the way the furniture was arranged to make the most of the limited space. It was horrifying to realize that people could exist in plain sight, hidden in walls, living alongside others without anyone knowing. I tried to imagine how long they had been there, what they had eaten, how they had survived without detection. Every detail made me feel more uneasy, and I kept glancing back at the motel, imagining eyes watching me from behind those thin walls. Once I collected myself enough to drive, I went to a nearby cafe to eat something and calm down. I pulled out my phone and started searching online for similar cases, hoping to find some explanation. It didn't take long to find forums and articles detailing hidden squatter rooms in budget motels near airports. People shared stories of tiny, secret spaces where squatters lived unnoticed, sometimes for months, taking food and supplies from the rooms around them. The stories described the same makeshift beds, the same scattered furniture, the same stench of old, unwashed blankets. Reading those accounts made my stomach twist, but it also gave me a strange sense of relief. I wasn't imagining things, this really happened. The hidden room wasn't a fluke. It was part of a disturbing pattern in low-cost motels. I thought about reporting it again, to the police this time, but I realized there wasn't much they could do after the fact. The motel staff had already seen it and done nothing. The hidden room could still be there, waiting for the next guest to stumble upon it. I shivered at the thought, feeling the lingering tension in my body. I made a note to never stay in motels that seemed cheap or suspicious, to always check every corner and avoid places with a history of complaints. The rest of my trip passed without incident, but the memory of that hidden room stayed with me. Every time I thought about cheap motels or stayed near airports, I couldn't help but imagine tiny rooms tucked behind closets, people living silently in the shadows, completely unnoticed. I realized how easy it was for someone to exist on the fringes, invisible, yet present, and it left me with a deep sense of unease. Even now, months later, I can picture that cramped little space, the old mattress, the torn sheets, the dim corners filled with discarded clothes. I think about the person who lived there, wondering if they were caught, if they moved on, or if they were still out there, hidden in some other motel, waiting for the next unsuspecting guest. It was a sobering reminder of how little we notice about the spaces we occupy, and how much can exist right under our noses without our knowledge. The incident changed the way I looked at motels, hotels, and even my own surroundings, making me more alert, more aware, and a little more wary of the world around me.